How is it possible that a failure invisible to all of Ferrari's telemetry was detected only by Hamilton, and that this problem was also compromising the entire design of the SF25 without anyone noticing? Qatar, Friday, November 28, 2025. The Lusail route was fast, technical, and with conditions that did not forgive even a millimeter of error. It was sprint qualifying day, one of those moments where the pressure intensifies because any failure, no matter how minor, can condemn the rest of the weekend. In that context, what happened with Lewis Hamilton surprised everyone, but not because of a visible error, but because of the invisible. Hamilton was eliminated in the first qualifying round, SQ1, finishing a humiliating 18th place. For any driver this would be worrying, but for a 7-time world champion who now races for Ferrari, the situation takes on dramatic overtones. His teammate, Charles Leclerc, with the same car, managed to advance to SQ3 and place 9th. That disparity was strange, unexpected, and did not fit with Hamilton's technical history or base performance. The logical thing was to think that it was poor tire preparation, or that Lewis had simply not managed to get the soft compounds up to temperature at the right time. That was, in fact, the initial interpretation of the Ferrari team and engineers. A bad timing, a lap compromised by traffic, or perhaps an unusual driving error. However, there was a problem. Hamilton did not accept that explanation. The moment he stepped off SF25, his body language said it all. It was not frustration with himself, nor sporting disappointment. It was technical anger. From the first meters of the exit lap, I had noticed an abnormal behavior in the car. Something wasn't working structurally, but it wasn't an obvious failure. There was no smoke, no loose parts, no error messages on the screen. However, the car did not behave as it should. Hamilton expressed it clearly as soon as he stepped into the garage. He said the rear axle did not respond with the usual stiffness in high lateral load corners. That there was a floating sensation, a subtle but constant disconnection between the aerodynamic platform and the suspension. A problem that only appeared in certain sectors of the circuit and only when extreme loads were combined, intense braking and fast turning. And that wasn't something that could easily be shown in the data, at least not in the conventional graphs that engineers handled during classification. The Ferrari technicians listened to him, but as often happens when a driver points out a problem without immediate support in the telemetry, skepticism was in the air. They reviewed the data. Everything seemed normal. Correct pressures, aerodynamic loads within range, suspensions working within parameters. Nothing indicated a failure. But Hamilton was unwilling to accept a simplistic diagnosis. He knew what she had felt. At that moment, one of those stories began that, if they were not leaked later, would remain as internal anecdotes. Hamilton asked the team to cross-reference data variables that were not normally contrasted with each other. I wanted them to look at the micro-displacements of the car floor in relation to the rear suspension compression right at the lateral load peaks. He indicated specific sectors of the circuit where he had noticed the anomaly. He spoke in technical language not as a pilot but almost as an engineer. And the most shocking thing was that, by paying attention to him, the engineers began to find clues. Not an obvious failure, but an anomalous behavior. A slight aerodynamic collapse of the ground at specific moments, so fast that it seemed like a simple whiplash or loss of usual grip. A structural micro-disconnection that not even the real-time monitoring system was able to highlight due to its brevity. That day, Lewis didn't just drive. He diagnosed a hidden fault that was compromising the entire performance of the car. His elimination in SQ1 was not the result of his mistake, but rather a defect that the team had failed to detect. And although his qualification was a disaster in terms of result, what he achieved by forcing this technical review was even more valuable. Because thanks to his insistence, Ferrari was about to discover a problem that, if it had gone unnoticed, would have put in check not only the sprint in Qatar, but the entire SF25 development campaign. What Hamilton detected that afternoon in Qatar was not a simple loss of traction, nor a setup error. What he discovered was a hidden behavioral pattern that conventional telemetry was not programmed to reveal. A phenomenon so fleeting and specific that it required not only experience, but an unusual technical sensitivity to perceive it. What for any other driver would have been just an annoyance or a whiplash of the rear axle, for Lewis was a profound alarm signal. The car had an intermittent structural failure, and the worst of all is that the technology did not show it. The anomaly, according to the leaks, centered on a millimeter disconnection between the floor of the SF25 and its rear suspension. A sudden loss of downforce that did not appear as an alert in the data, but was camouflaged among stable variables. What Hamilton felt was a dissonance between what the car was supposed to do according to the numbers and what it actually did on the asphalt. This disconnection manifested itself only under a very specific condition: extreme cross loads. That is, when the car braked sharply while entering a fast curve. And this is not common in all circuits, but it is characteristic of areas such as the second and third sectors of the Lusail layout. The key to the failure was in the interaction between the aerodynamic design of the floor and the pull rod suspension system that Ferrari had integrated into the SF25. Under normal circumstances, the car worked correctly. But upon reaching a combined peak of lateral and vertical loading, the bottom of the car subtly collapsed, losing the suction that kept it glued to the ground. This loss didn't last more than a few milliseconds, but it was enough to make the rear axle feel unstable, like it was letting go of the asphalt for an instant. And that, in Formula One, is a death sentence for a fast lap. Engineers initially attributed this sensation to poor tire warming management, especially because the soft compounds presented inconsistencies in the first laps, something common in conditions like those in Qatar. But Hamilton flatly refused to accept that explanation. He insisted that the anomalous behavior did not depend on the temperature of the tires, but on an inadequate mechanical reaction of the chassis when certain G-forces were reached. In short, this phantom ruling not only explained the Qatar catastrophe, it revealed a vulnerability at the heart of SF25 that would have jeopardized multiple race weekends. And most impressive of all is that it was identified not by the data, nor by the engineers, nor by the simulators. It was identified by a man who, even after 2 decades in the category, continues to demonstrate that his greatest weapon is not talent, but his ability to understand the car as if it were an extension of his own body. But perhaps the biggest earthquake occurred at the political level within the team. Hamilton's intervention showed an internal gap between what the technical structure believed it knew and what was really happening on the track. It wasn't just a question of data. It was a question of credibility. How could Ferrari's telemetry system fail on something so critical? Why did track engineers initially dismiss the trial of their star driver? These questions began to circulate among the team's senior management, and although they have not been made public, it is known that technical evaluation meetings were convened in Maranello to review the real-time data interpretation protocols. What was at stake was not only the integrity of the car, but internal confidence in the validation processes that underpin the entire sports operation. This incident also changed Hamilton's relationship with the team. Until that moment, although there was mutual respect, there was still a certain natural distance between a newcomer star and a structure as hierarchical as Ferrari's. But after Qatar, that dynamic changed. The British's internal perception stopped being that of a pilot who needs time to adapt, and became that of a strategic asset that can detect what machines cannot. His analytical skills became a critical tool, and his influence in technical meetings grew exponentially. In fact, from that moment on, he was given greater participation in the planning of suspension development, something that is normally outside the direct reach of the pilot. In short, the Qatar Phantom failure was not just a technical problem, it was a catalyst for redefining processes, hierarchies, and strategies within Ferrari. It showed that even in an era dominated by artificial intelligence, sensors, and predictive algorithms, it is still essential to have human sensitivity that can interpret what the data cannot yet show. And in that field, Hamilton established himself not only as a driver, but as the best diagnostic instrument that Ferrari has this season. A machine interpreting another machine. A man challenging the system. What happened in Qatar was not just an isolated incident, nor a simple example of a driver who felt something strange on the track. It was a practical demonstration of why, at the pinnacle of motorsport, the difference is not always in what is evident, in what is seen, in what is measured. Sometimes the difference is found in what is not detected. As far as it escapes the graphics, the sensors, the data interpretation systems that dominate modern Formula One. And that is where the figure of Lewis Hamilton acquires a new value beyond the championships, beyond the statistics. For years there has been debate about the real weight of a pilot in an era where engineering and aerodynamics seem to make almost all the difference. To what extent can a driver change the technical destiny of a car? What can a human being contribute in the midst of hundreds of millions of lines of code, CFD simulations, and automated test benches? Qatar answered that question forcefully. Hamilton's ability to identify an anomaly that went unnoticed by dozens of trained engineers, and that was perfectly camouflaged among normal data, brings an uncomfortable truth to the table. Telemetry has limits. No matter how advanced data collection systems are, they are still interpretations of physical variables translated into digital language. And that language, no matter how sophisticated it may be, cannot replace the direct perception of the dynamic behavior of a car when driving at more than 280 km/h, with extreme G-forces, on a technical curve and in an extreme situation. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.